A pot of beans and a pan of cornbread. That's it. That's the meal. Dried beans simmered most of the day with a piece of salt pork and a skillet of cornbread to go with it. $2 will still buy you the ingredients today, and it will feed a family. For roughly a century, it was the daily food of the southern mountains, eaten so often in so many households that people who grew up on it can describe the exact sound the lid made. And almost everything about how we talk about it now is wrong. It's called a poor meal, something people ate because they had nothing better, cheap food for hard times. That is not what it is. That combination is one of the most efficient protein systems ever assembled by human beings. A piece of nutritional engineering so precise that it was independently discovered, refined and defended across 2 continents for thousands of years before anyone could explain a single thing about why it worked. It is not what people ate when the good food ran out. It is the reason the good food running out did not kill them. $2 is the punchline, not the story. And there is a second thing sitting inside this meal, which is that the version most people cook today uses the wrong bean. Not a worse bean, a foreign one. It arrived on a railroad. It does not grow in these mountains. And the reason it took over tells you almost everything about what happened to this region. So, the meal, the chemistry, the field, the seed, and then what was actually lost. Start with the object itself, because the details are the argument. Dried beans go into water the night before, or into the pot at dawn if nobody remembers. In goes a piece of cured pork, ham hock, hog jowl, streaked meat, fatback, whatever is hanging. Water to cover, then heat low for hours. What comes out is not soup. Say that clearly because people in the region are particular about it. It is soup beans, beans in their own thick broth, where the liquid has become as much of the dish as the beans. That broth is pot liquor, the same word the green pot produces, and it is not drained off. That is the point. Alongside it, cornbread. Not sweet, not cake-like. A plain cornmeal bread baked in an iron skillet, and its job is structural. You crumble it into the bowl, or you stop with it. Either way, the bread and the broth end up in the same mouthful, and hold on to that. Because in Chapter 2, it stops being a serving suggestion and becomes the entire reason this works. Around the edges, whatever the season allowed. A raw onion, quartered, eaten in bites alongside. Chow chow, that sharp pickled relish of cabbage and green tomato, spooned over the top. Fried potatoes, a side of greens. In summer, sliced tomatoes. None of those are decorations. Every one of them is doing a nutritional job we will get to shortly. The pork is doing more than flavor, incidentally. Beans are filling but not calorie-dense, and a family doing 10 hours of physical labor needs energy as much as protein. The fat back in the pot is what turns a bowl of beans into a day's work. And the practical genius of the thing, it improves. Each time a pot of soup beans is reheated, the beans break down further, the broth thickens, and the dish gets better. A pot cooked Sunday is still dinner Wednesday, and it is better on Wednesday. In a household with no refrigeration and a great deal of work to do, a dish that rewards being made once and eaten 4 times is not a compromise. It is a design feature. So that is the meal. Cheap, filling, endlessly repeatable. Now, why does it work? Because filling and nourishing are 2 different things, and plenty of cheap food fills you while quietly starving you. Here is the part almost nobody knows. and it is genuine biochemistry. Your body needs 9 essential amino acids, the building blocks of protein it cannot manufacture and must get from food. Missing enough of any one of them, and the rest are wasted. Protein synthesis stalls at whatever is in shortest supply. Nutritionists call that shortage the limiting amino acid, and the useful way to picture it is a barrel made of staves of different heights. The water level is set by the shortest stave, no matter how tall the others are. Now look at the two halves of this meal separately. Corn is short on lysine, and uniquely among common cereals, it is also short on tryptophan. Maize is the one grain deficient in both. A diet leaning heavily on corn is a diet quietly rationing 2 essential amino acids. Beans are the opposite. Legumes are rich in lysine. What they lack are the sulfur-containing amino acids, methionine and cysteine, which is precisely what cereals carry in reasonable supply. Put those two together in one bowl, and each covers the other's gap. Corn brings the methionine that beans lack. Beans bring the lysine and tryptophan that corn lacks. Neither one alone is adequate protein. Together they are close to complete. This is called protein complementation, and it is not folklore or wellness theory. It is standard nutritional science, taught in every introductory course, and the beans and grain pairing is the textbook example. Beans and cornbread, rice and lentils, tortillas and frijoles, hummus and pita. Every one of those is the same equation solved by a different culture. Notice how many separate cuisines landed on the same answer without any contact between them. That is not cultural borrowing. That is a large number of people over a very long time running the only experiment available to them, eating something for a generation and watching whether their children grew, and converging on the correct result. The Food and Agriculture Organization has studied the maize and bean combination in detail and found the optimum somewhere around a 7:3 ratio of maize to beans, which is, to a reasonable approximation, a bowl of beans and a piece of cornbread. And now the honest caveat, because it matters and it sets up Chapter 5. Even at that optimal ratio, the FAO work found that a maize and bean diet alone is still not adequate for small children. It gets much better with milk, or eggs, or meat, or a real vegetable alongside. So the mountain meal was not magic, and it was not sufficient by itself. It was the floor, the reliable base that made the rest survivable. A household that had beans and cornbread and a cow and a garden was fine. A household that had only the corn half was in serious trouble, and we will come back to what that looked like. Add the fat and salt from the pork, which carry calories and make it edible day after day. Add the raw onion and the chow chow, which put vitamin C on top of a winter meal. Add the fiber, the iron, the folate, the potassium in the beans and in the broth. That bowl is not a compromise, it is a solved problem. Now the harder question, and the one that turns a recipe into a piece of history. How does a family with no laboratory arrive at exactly the right pairing, and keep it for generations without ever knowing why? The answer is that they did not work it out in the kitchen. They worked it out in the field. The corn and the beans were not two crops, they were one. Across the Americas, long before European contact, maize, beans and squash were grown together in a single intercropped system, the Three Sisters. Corn planted in a mound, beans planted at the base of the corn, squash or pumpkins spread on the ground between the mounds. Every part of that arrangement is doing work. The corn grows tall and provides a living pole for the beans to climb. No trellis, no stakes, no labor. The beans climb it, and in return they do something the farmers could observe but not explain. Beans host nitrogen-fixing bacteria in nodules on their roots, pulling nitrogen out of the air and putting it into the soil, which feeds the corn. Corn is a heavy nitrogen feeder. Beans are a nitrogen supplier. In a world with no commercial fertilizer, that is not a nice bonus. That is the difference between a field that keeps producing and a field that quits. The bean vines also tie the corn stalks together, which helps the whole stand resist wind. The squash sprawls across the ground with broad leaves, shading the soil, holding moisture in and choking weeds out. On steep mountain ground, that ground cover is doing something else as well. It slows the water and holds the soil in place during heavy rain, on slopes where erosion can take a field apart in a season. And this is not just a picturesque tradition, it has been measured. The agricultural scientist Jane Mount Pleasant, of Tuscarora descent, found that the Three Sisters system yields about the same amount of food energy as growing maize alone on the same land, but significantly more protein because the interplanted beans and squash come essentially for free in terms of ground. You do not sacrifice corn to grow beans. You get the beans on top of the corn. Read that again in the context of Chapter 2. The field produces the two crops that complete each other's amino acids on the same ground at the same time, with each one improving the other's yield. That system came out of Mesoamerica and spread north over thousands of years, and it was practiced across the eastern woodlands, including by the Cherokee in these mountains, long before any settler arrived. European settlers coming into southern Appalachia did what settlers did across the eastern seaboard. They adopted it. They planted beans in the corn. They even kept the name. Those beans are still called cornfield beans, pole beans specifically suited to being grown up a cornstalk, and a category you can still buy seed for today. And note the requirement that comes with them. The corn has to be strong enough to carry a bean vine. Modern hybrid corn generally is not. Old open pollinated varieties like Hickory King are. So the complementary protein meal on the table is not a lucky coincidence of the kitchen. It is a direct printout of what the field produced, grown together, harvested together, and eaten together. A piece of indigenous agricultural science that mountain families inherited, used for 2 centuries, and mostly stopped being able to name. But the beans themselves have a story that is still stranger. Southern Appalachia holds a richer store of bean genetic diversity than anywhere else on the planet. That is not a regional boast. It is a documented consequence of how these communities lived. In a landscape of steep ground, poor roads and small isolated holdings, families saved their own seed year after year, selecting, without any formal breeding program, for what worked in their particular hollow, their particular soil, their particular frost date. Over generations that produces varieties that exist nowhere else and belong to nowhere else. They were called family beans, and they were inherited like property, passed at weddings, carried when a family moved, argued over when someone died. The seed saver Bill Best, who founded the Sustainable Mountain Agriculture Center in Kentucky, has spent decades collecting them and holds something on the order of 175 varieties. As he became known, families began entrusting him with their seed, which tells you what the seed meant. The names alone are a folk archive. Greasy beans, so called because the pods are slick rather than fuzzy, a texture you can feel with your fingers. Cut shorts, whose seeds crowd each other square in the pod. Half runners, turkey craw, case knife, lazy wife, tobacco worm, Logan giant, and then the ones named after actual people. Bertie Best, Grandpa Bishop, Aunt Nan's bean. Best's own account of where these came from is the part that should stop you. Many family beans, he argues, originated as mutations, a sport, an odd plant that appeared in somebody's bean patch that somebody noticed, kept, and grew on separately. Which means an unknown number of these varieties exist because a specific woman, on a specific afternoon, in a specific row, looked at one plant and decided it was worth saving. That is plant breeding, done without training, without funding, without records, at the scale of a garden across 200 years. And Best puts the nutritional point more bluntly than any textbook. The protein in beans is what kept a great many mountain families from starving. They might have had a hog or two, but, as he observes, you do not see old photographs of fat mountaineers. The beans were eaten fresh in summer, canned or dried for winter. Dried in the pod on a string, they became shuck beans or leather breeches. The same drying method, with rehydrated skins that go nearly silky, and a flavour nothing like a fresh green bean. So here is the picture at the end of the 19th century. A region with the world's deepest bean diversity, growing its own seed, planting it in its own corn, eating the result with its own cornbread. And then that entire system got replaced by a bean from a sack. Say the words soup beans in the mountains today, and you mean one thing: pintos. Pintos are the standard. Brown beans, in the older regional phrasing, bags of them in every grocery from eastern Kentucky to western North Carolina. Pintos are not from here. They are a Central American bean. The name is Spanish, given by conquistadors for the speckled, painted look of the seed coat. Today they are grown commercially at scale in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, and they account for something like 42% of American bean production. They were not historically cultivated in Appalachia. In a region holding hundreds of locally adapted varieties, the one that became the emblem of mountain cooking is an import, and it arrived by rail. The mechanism is unglamorous and completely decisive. From the mid-1800s onward, railroads pushed into and through the mountains, and with them came bulk goods from the Midwest and West. Pintos could be shipped in 25 and 40-pound sacks. They were cheap, they were uniform, they kept for months, and, crucially, buying them required no garden, no seed saving, no trellis, no season, and no labour. For a family increasingly working for wages rather than farming, in a coal camp, a mill village, a timber town, a sack of pintos was not a step down. It was the only way to keep eating beans at all. There is no villain in that. Nobody was tricked. Given wage work, a company store and no land, buying beans is simply the right decision, and pintos cook down beautifully, which is why the dish is genuinely good rather than merely cheap. So the dish survived, and the system underneath it did not. The meal stayed on the table. The bowl looks the same. But the cornfield bean, the corn stalk it climbed, the nitrogen it fixed, the seed saved from last year, the woman who spotted the sport in the row, all of that quietly dropped out, and what remained was a purchase. And there is one more thing worth saying plainly, because it is the sharpest fact in this entire story. This meal only ever worked as a pair. Beans and corn together are close to complete protein. Corn without beans is not. And in exactly the decades when mountain and southern households were shifting from growing food to buying it, the balance in many households tipped hard toward the corn side. Cornmeal, fatback, molasses, bought on credit, and away from the beans, the milk, and the garden. The result was pellagra, a niacin deficiency epidemic that ran through the American South from around 1906 into the 1930s and killed on the order of 100,000 people. The households that kept the full system, the beans, the greens, the cow, the hog, largely came through it. The households that had only the cheap half did not. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a metaphor. It is the same equation, failing. So what was the $2 meal, actually? It was not poor food. It was the visible end of an agricultural system thousands of years old, developed by indigenous farmers in the Americas, adopted in these mountains, refined seed by people who never wrote any of it down. A system that produced 2 crops on one piece of ground, each feeding the other, each completing the other on the plate. The cost was never the point. The cost was the result. It was cheap because it was efficient, and it was efficient because it was correct. You can still make it tonight for about $2. Beans, cornbread, a little pork, and an onion. Just know what you're holding. That bowl is the last surviving piece of the most elegant food system this continent ever produced. And the only part of it we kept was the part that comes in a bag. And that is the strange shape of what happened here. Nothing was destroyed. Nobody banned a bean. The knowledge did not fail. It simply stopped being necessary, one household at a time, and knowledge that stops being necessary stops being taught. The seed is still out there. People like Bill Best are still saving it, and the varieties are still available to anyone who wants to plant one. That part is not gone. It is just not on your shelf.